My remarks today are Ronald Coase with aspects of Arrow and Williamson. Ronald Coase had a long, varied, and important career. My discussion is not a representative treatment. I expect, however, that our collective discussion of Coase will cover the highlights. The paper is developed in 6 parts. Section 1 examines Coase's education in the early years, that is 1930 to 37. Section 2 is a brief discussion of externalities by Coase in 1960 and later by Ken Arrow in 1968. Section 3 discusses public policy in disarray and efforts in the 1970s to break away from orthodox public policy. Section 4 is a brief discussion of transaction cost economics, but let me put it, I think I'll skip that, but it is, I'll give you a couple of remarks there, but it's a long enough presentation as it is, and I decided I had to cut back on something. Section 5 is a sketch of ISNI, and Section 6 is an as-if discussion between Ronald and me. Okay, so Coase in the 1930s. Sidney Winter and I were both at Yale in 1987, which year was the 50th year after Coase published his 1937 paper on the nature of the firm. We thought that 1987 was a noteworthy event and contacted Coase to see if he had an interest in organizing a conference to revisit the issues. Coase was not only expressly interested, but furthermore proposed to prepare 3 lectures, the first on the origin, the second on the meaning, and the third on the nature of the firm. His first lecture concentrates on the complications he encountered when he was seeking to define a research program upon which to base his dissertation. There were obstacles. Part of the difficulty is that by reason of lack of Latin and mathematics, Coase was unable to qualify for a senior science degree. For a science degree. Such a degree being out of reach, he decided to work on a commerce degree. One such possibility was to take up what he referred to as Group D industry as part of the Bachelor of Commerce, which group he describes was recommended to those wishing to enter the engineering and metal trades, distributing trades in certain instances, and generally for those engaged in works in factory management. It was a choice occupation for which Coase described himself as, quote, singularly ill-suited. But what else was there for someone to do who did not know Latin and did not like mathematics? Grim, but not as bad as they seemed. For one thing, Coase had considerable perseverance upon which he could call. Also, a new teacher, Ronald Plant, had terminated his teaching at Cape Town and accepted an appointment at the London School of Economics. Plant had long taken the subject of economics seriously, and he communicated that attitude to Coase. Also, Coase and his fellow student, Ronald Fowler, perceived the common need to develop a deeper understanding of contract and its relation to economics. Qualifying, as he did, for a Cassell traveling scholarship, Coase decided to spend the next year in the United States, where he mainly examined the purposes served by various forms of large economic organization. And he describes it as follows. Excuse me. The route which was ultimately to take me to a theory of integration is a curious one, and the more so because it came about in part as a result of examining the role in promoting vertical integration of what is now called asset specificity. I cannot say exactly how I came to hit upon the solution. Getting an idea is the kind of process in which you don't know what you're doing until you've done it. The solution was to realize that there were costs of making transactions in a market economy, and that it was necessary to incorporate them into the analysis. This was not done in economics at that time, nor, I may add, is it in most present-day economic theory. However, once taken into account, everything falls into place. Falls into place, however, is a vague claim. What exactly are the mechanisms? It is noteworthy that this would remain a vague claim even after Coase's paper, The Nature of the Firm, was published in 1937 by Economica. Most certainly, one of his insightful observations is that, quote, outside of the firm, price movements direct protection, which is coordinated through a series of exchange transactions on the market. Within a firm, these market transactions are eliminated, and in place of the complicated market structure with exchange transactions is substituted the entrepreneur coordinator who directs production. This is Coase 1937, and he observes that we have to explain the basis on which, in practice, the choice between alternatives is effective. That was left for others to work on. Well, now I want to move to part two, which is externalities. Although Coase's 1937 article was for many years ignored, his 1960 paper on the problem of social cost got immediate attention. Kenneth Arrow's remarks were especially instructive, and these are Arrow's remarks. Current writing has helped bring out the point that market failure is not absolute. It is better to consider a broader category, that of transaction costs, which in general impede and in particular cases completely block the formation of markets. It is usually, though not always, emphasized that transaction costs are costs of running the economic system. An incentive for vertical integration is replacement of the costs of buying and selling in the market by the costs of intra-firm transfers. The existence of vertical integration may suggest that the costs of operating competitive markets are not zero, as is usually assumed in our theoretical analysis. And you should bear in mind that this was stated back in 1968, and things have changed since. But a new science of comparative institutional analysis would eventually take hold, albeit gradually. Part three, and this is the National Bureau of Economics Research involving itself in the issues. Ronald Coase and I were two among four economists who were invited by the National Bureau of Economic Research to participate in the November 1970 panel on policy issues and research opportunities in industrial organization. Victor Fuchs, as moderator, opened the discussion as follows, and really succinct but to the point. And he says, "Whither industrial organization? All is not well with this once flourishing field." And that was exactly right. The fact is that industrial organization, for the most part, was content that it was flourishing and was not about to be changed. As between Coase and me, Coase was the more skeptical of the two of us. Yet Fuchs also records similarities between us. And this is a quote from Fuchs. Both Coase and Williamson stress the need to study why firms are formed and why they assume certain activities and not others. According to Coase, quote, the source of the gain from having a firm is that the operation of market costs something, and by forming an organization and allowing the allocation of resources to be determined administratively, these costs are saved. In a similar vein, Williamson concludes that, quote, the question of organizational design is intrinsically interesting and inseparably associated with efficiency considerations. The study of firm and market structures can benefit from more systematic examination of the sources and consequences of market failure and by a fair assessment of the powers and limits of internal organization, unquote. I would describe my 1971 paper on the vertical integration of production, market failure considerations, as follows. 1. This entails an examination of economic organization through the lens of contract rather than the lens of orthodoxy. 2. It provides for bounded rationality on which to account all complex contracts incomplete. 3. It makes provision for strategic behavior, that is, defection from the spirit of cooperation, if an outsourced good or service experiences disturbances for which the stakes are great. And 4, it distinguishes between investments in generic assets and specific assets, where a bilateral dependency relation between buyer and seller is ascribed to the latter. Taken together, the arguments come down to this. Whereas efficient intermediate product-market exchange is usually well served by simple market exchange if the assets are generic, the advantage shifts to hierarchy as bilateral dependency builds up by reason of asset specificity and outlier disturbances. But while these views were taking shape for some of us, public policy toward business remained, for the most part, in the structure, conduct, performance camp. Indeed, industrial organization in the structure, conduct, performance tradition was confident that this framework was altogether efficacious, both as it relates to textbook industrial organization and for antitrust enforcement purposes. Minority challenges, however, were beginning to appear. To the dismay of older-style I.O., the new economics of organization was asking, what is going on here? And pressing the issue. Ronald Coase contributed to this and his more microanalytic mode of analysis in which transaction costs were both important and susceptible to analysis. Thus, although textbook industrial organization and antitrust enforcement agencies, and I emphasize agencies because there were antitrust specialists out there that were beginning to become cautious. But the textbook I.O. and the enforcement agencies appeared to be content that with things that they were without any remorse. But Coase and Williamson and Fuchs, among others, who participated at the National Bureau of Economics program, made their case. For many of us, a new institutional economics would be soon upon us, wherein firm and market were alternative markets were alternative modes of governance to be aligned with transaction in an economizing way. So, item 4 is one that actually I'm going to skip over for purposes of taking too much time. But it's a paper of mine entitled Transaction Cost Economics, the Governance of Contractual Relations, which actually turned out to be a very successful paper, and I recommend it to you if you have the opportunity. It was published in the Journal of Law and Economics in 1979. The next item actually is a really short item, and it's a little controversial, and I'm stepping beyond my knowledge in certain respects, but I thought I would bring it up anyway. And it's about ISNE. The new institutional economics was taking on an identity of its own as a growing number of researchers made their interests known. A meeting was held in Washington University, and a decision was made to organize the International Society for New Institutional Economics. The first 3 presidents of which would be Ronald Coase, followed by Douglas North, and the third being myself. There were, to be sure, a lot of startup costs and controversies. Indeed, broad agreement notwithstanding, there have been continuing controversies and reforms. Passing on the gavel to a series of competent young leaders from North America, Europe, and spreading out to include Asia will be, or at least is prospectively, transformative. Finally, we reach it to item 6, the wrap-up, and it begins with a letter from Ronald Coase. Actually, many of my colleagues and students organized a 70th birthday party for me in the year 2002. Coase did not attend that party, but he sent me a letter on October 23rd that reads in part as follows. Oliver, all economists who have an interest in transaction cost economics owe an immense debt to you. Indeed, transaction cost economics is, to a large extent, your creation. 70 is no age at which to stop this important work. I know that you won't. While I hope to benefit from some of the work that you will be doing in the next 30 years, most of the benefit will inevitably go to others. I envy them. With all good wishes, Ronald Coase. Several things from this note bear remark. For one, I am prepared to take some credit for transaction cost economics, but have grave doubts that I would have started down this track but for the earlier work of Coase and Arrow. I also, moreover, am of the view that my 3 years of training at the Graduate School of Industrial Administration at Carnegie were foundational for me and others in interdisciplinary respects. Economics, to be sure, was central, but interdisciplinary social science was crucially important. Also, I do not want to omit the years from 1988 to 2004 when I was teaching economics at Berkeley. My graduate students were extraordinary, both in the classroom and in the workshop. They were, for me, a teaching experience beyond belief. Well, now I come to the last exchange between Ronald and myself and how we related. Much of Ronald's work predated mine. To repeat, I have grave doubts that my work on the theory of the firm and applied welfare economics would have materialized had I not read Coase and Arrow. Both have been generous in recognizing my work and making provision for it, as witness the remarks of Kenneth elsewhere, but Coase in the context of of my earlier remarks. And Coase actually sort of sent me the following material. Although attention given to my argument on the nature of the firm in the 1970s and 1980s derived in part from the interest of my views generated by the social cost article, and this is Coase describing himself here now, and the greater appreciation of the importance of transaction costs which brought it about, the writings of Williamson must have had the same effect. His book, Corporate Control on Business Behavior, published in 1970, and especially his Markets and Hierarchies, published in 1975, must have made many economists aware that there was an approach to industrial organization different from that commonly espoused. The alternative approach that Williamson presented depended on the distinction between markets and hierarchy, incorporated transaction costs into the analysis, and examined in most great detail what is unusual with economists, the problems of the internal organization of the firm. His approach is broadly consistent with the nature of the firm, which of course was Coase, to which he refers, and must have led some economists to examine and re-examine the article. Williamson ascribes the non-use of my thesis, so often claimed as a fundamental insight, to the fact that it had not been made operational. As Williamson said in 1975, transaction costs are appropriately made the centerpiece of the analysis, but Coase did not operationalize these in a fashion which permits one to assess the efficacy of completing transactions as between markets and hierarchies in a systematic way. Williamson has reaffirmed this view in 1985 and 1986. I think it is largely correct. Well, here we are to the last paragraph. No question that Coase, both on his own and through his influence on others, will be with us forever. One of the ways that he will be remembered is that he shares credit so generously. Thank you very much.